everyone sick? Okay. In which case, yes. So hi everyone, and welcome to the one before last training of this term. So this time we're going to finally be leaving from economics. Finally, for some, I guess at least, and we're going to be talking about sports. So another fun topic, I guess. So if I can get the next slide. First thing I want to talk about is the structure of the workshop. So the reason to why we are highlighting the workshop structure, which is going to be according to sports and certain issues that are linked to it. For example, we're going to start by talking broadly about sports in and of itself, but then we're going to move on to motions or arguments that relate to sports and economics, sports and social justice, and lastly, sports and IR. The reason why we structured it in this way, and I think this is an important thing to consider when you think about sports debates, is that most of them, if not all of them, are not only about sport, and there's often an aspect of different debates and different topics in them. In some cases, they are literally not about sport at all. So this is probably good news, especially for people who maybe are not like particular sport nerds and you don't know the like lot of spec knowledge in terms of sport. The good news is that if you know things about the other topics that we've already discussed, you might be able to generate a lot of matter without having particularly in-depth knowledge about sports. So just to go slightly more into detail in what we're going to be covering, so starting with a couple notes on sport in of itself, that's going to be mainly about how to impact sports and how to impact how individuals interact with them. I don't have motion examples under this. The simple reason is because very often those are not motions, specific motions that are just about sport, but often those are clashes that are present in all the other motions. So there might be two arguments about economics, but then one really important clash where you're actually discussing the sport in and of itself. So we're going to flag it. Secondly, then sports and economics. So those are motions along the lines of, for example, the Liverpool motion 2 weeks ago, regretting the trend of foreign investors purchasing football clubs, with often similarly with discussing about like Saudi Arabia purchasing clubs, etc., that was said also at a couple of tournaments recently. Or I think very classic motion about clubs being required to be majority owned by their fans. Second, we're going to talk about sports and social justice. So that's often motions that relate to quotas, or the Dogsbridge World's motion about NFL that people did not seem to like too much because hard and no one knows what draft picks are. We're also not going to explain what draft picks are, I'm afraid, but we're going to explain how to debate that motion or similar motions. And lastly, on sports and IR, so those are often motions like in terms of where big sporting events should be hosted and how it impacts the international relations. So hopefully those should be broadly all the motions that you tend to see, or the topics, the themes of motion that you tend to see about sports. So let's get into it. So if I can get the next slide. Cool. So starting with the notes that we have in terms of making arguments about sports in itself and sort of enjoyment of sport in itself, etc. So I think the problem that often happens with sports debates, similar to things like our debates, etc., is that teams often struggle a lot to make the sport impact sound impactful. So often people say things like, oh, people really care about sport, but then they can't explain it in a way that the judge considers to be important, and often get outweighed by other consideration, for example, the economic consideration, etc. So what is necessary to do in order to be able to make arguments about people enjoying sports or people having their local club and being able to support it, etc., good and stick in the debate is to do a good and quite detailed actor analysis in explaining why individuals care about sport and how actually important for them it is. So there's a couple of mechanisms that we have to that you can use in order to explain that. So I think the first one is to just explain that in many cases, individuals tie their identity very closely to the club that they are supporting. That is done through many activities, such as you attend matches regularly, you are making or buying merch, etc., or collecting it, you are learning a lot of information about the club. in that process, individuals often really tie their identity into being a fan of that club. They describe themselves as being fans of that club, meaning that individuals actually identify with the club so much that if the club wins, like they generally feel it as a victory for themselves, they get a massive amount of satisfaction for it. So like I think people know about how often people are referring to we won or we lost, when obviously they didn't win anything, like that team did, but individuals still have that that they identify with the team so much that they perceive it as if it's their own victory or their own loss, etc. The second mechanism is that very often individuals form communities around the club and sport they support. So it becomes, apart from being just a sport, a social activity where you have shared interests with the people that you are attending it with. So the reason why people care about it then is because it's a way for them to form close relationships, that like strong friend groups where they have shared interests that like tend to be quite close, where they can discuss the same things, etc., meaning that they do have a big relation to it as a result of that. Secondly, often it becomes a sort of a trained social response to be very, very happy and celebrate with the individuals you are with, the friend group when your team wins. So as it becomes kind of trained, like it is just people that just feel happy as a result of the fact that this is just something that they keep doing and doing within their friend group, and it's just how they react. And lastly, often it's a nostalgic thing. So people often start supporting their club because of, for example, their family used to support it, or their local, people in the local area support it, and it's something that they started already as kids. So often they have a lot of really nice memories, for example, connected with their family bringing them to a football match when they were kids, and like having like really nice memories from that like really nice part of their life connected to it, which is why, like, again, the club is something that they hold very, very dearly in their heart. So I think the way to make it even more impactful is to point out that particularly in, for example, very economically deprived areas, or areas where it's hard to find something else to build your identity around. So, for example, you can't do it around your job particularly well, or in just the waiting room, etc. In specifically those areas where it's hard to build identity around anything else, sports is a very unique way in which individuals can find some sort of fulfillment and some sort of identity and some sort of meaning, something they can describe themselves as, which is what people often crave for. So this is a way that you can explain why sports is not just something that people are happy about or people enjoy, but something that is actually very, very crucial for them, and often crucial for how they perceive themselves and how they interact with the world in general. So these are mechanisms that you can use in a lot of debates. For example, explaining why it is good to have more access to sport, or if you need to explain why, for example, it would be really bad or detrimental if you had say a foreign owner changing the identity of the club or moving the stadium, etc. Those are the arguments you can use to make to explain why it would be in fact a really, really bad thing, and why people would have a really, really bad reaction to it, as opposed to like just describing sports as important and people are happy. So just to give an example of how this can be used. Often motions have a sort of an equality versus quality clash. So the example of this is the motion, this house believes that sports leagues should significantly tax and redistribute from wealthier teams to poorer teams, or any variation of that motion. There were plenty. So obviously there are other things that you can talk about in that debate that relate to economics, etc. But one of the clashes that exist here is the clash about, would we rather have a more equal league where the teams are on a broadly more similar level, or would we rather have a league where there is probably greater inequality, but you have overall you have some teams who are performing significantly better, so you get to see like the sort of maximum of human potential when it comes to those teams. So like, would you rather watch a really quality game, or would you rather have more equally for everyone. So the way that you can talk about on golf, if you want to talk about the in favor of having the equality and having the teams being similar to each other, even if you are kind of sacrificing the maximum level to which they can reach, is to explain why in leagues where there are few teams that are distinctly dominating constantly, and you have a lot of teams that are underperforming and constantly losing and never actually never winning the league or getting closer to win the league. You can explain why this is something that the people who support that club can take quite badly. You can explain why they get demoralized. Very often this happens because when you support a team, like often those fans do have a sort of an optimism bias. So even if I know that my club is not currently the winning one, given that I still know stories about a club that wasn't great, but then it suddenly had like a really good year and suddenly they won or got really close to winning. Like many teams fans you can describe think that this time it might be them. So there's often is that optimism, that often are those expectations, even though they are not particularly realistic. And similarly, you also interact with fans of other clubs. So if you attend the game of your club, you're going to see the fans of whoever's playing against you. If those are the fans of a very dominating team and you see them getting to celebrate and enjoy the fact that their team is winning and you never get to have those emotions, this is something that for those fans makes it much harder to enjoy the sport to its fullest and get to form the community and tie the identity insofar as it is just a more of a demoralizing atmosphere as opposed to being able to be proud and identify with that club properly. And secondly, you can talk about the fact that if you have a more equal playing field in terms of the league, you get a better narrative that makes people enjoy the sport more. So this can be within the league itself. So the sort of narrative about who gets to win the league, obviously, if there's one team that always wins the league, that it becomes quite boring, but also within the match itself. So if it's more of an up and down and it's not clear from the start who's going to win that match, it tends to be significantly more interesting for people to watch and enjoy. So I think the intuition pump here is that the people don't just go and check the results of the match. They actually want to see specifically what happens within the match. So even if I technically can just check the result and check, yes, I won and be happy about it, people want to see the narrative, they want to hear the commentary, they want to see what actually happened and kind of have the story of that victory narrated to them. So that narrative gets better when more of those matches get more up and down, more interesting, more engaging in that sense. I think the response to this, just to highlight, if you want to be able to beat it or mitigate it to a large extent, you can point out that people are in fact not that delusional, and very often they just base their expectation within the context. So if I am used to the fact that my team is just not going to be beating Manchester United all the time, and is probably going to be losing to a lot of those big teams, this is something that I am used to. I'm going to get a lot of happiness just from the things that are small successes, i.e. Where a Manchester United fan would probably not be happy, I am going to be happy about the fact that my team, I don't know, just scored against someone really big, or they managed to beat a team on a similar level, etc. And lastly, I think you can also point out that even if there is an inequality in terms of there is a top end and a low end, you still do have the exciting matches in most of those scenarios, because you still have like the bad teams playing against the bad teams, the really good teams playing against the really good teams. So in most cases, apart from the cases where like the one dominant team is crushing the lower one, you still have plenty of matches where you do get that sort of engaging narrative anyway. Sounds like either way, I think this is all. So if anyone has any questions regarding this, then drop it in the chat. I can answer now, or we can leave it for the Q&A at the end. But otherwise, I can get the next slide. Okay, so moving on to talking about sports and economics. So dividing into two parts, starting with I think what is quite a common clash that you tend to see a lot in debates about sports and econ, relating to owners. Who should own those clubs? Do we like the wealthy owners? Do we not like them? So in the example that I gave at the start, in the structure slide, was regretting sort of rich foreign owners or like investors buying clubs. So the often very important analysis, sorry, that you need to do is to describe what the incentives of those individuals are and how they are likely to be treating that club. So if you are in favor of the wealthy owner, you probably want to A, point out that they have money and they can use a lot of it, but B, very importantly, you need to explain why they have the incentive to use that capital well. If you are on the side who opposes, you want to be explaining why they, even though they might have money, they are going to be using it badly and it's actually not going to be profiting the people that it should be benefiting. So how to do this? So in terms of good incentives, I think the first analysis that you can do is that often if you have a wealthy foreign investor who wants to buy a club, the way they often do it is that they buy a club that is currently underperforming and they are likely to be bringing them up. So this often happens with a club that is just about to get to, say, the highest league, or a low performing club within the top league, and they are able to bring them up to start performing really well. So the reason you can give as to why they are likely to do it is because of the simple cost and benefit analysis. So i.e., if I'm really rich and foreign investor, if I'm going to buy a already really well-performing club, there is a high chance or like a decent chance that the club might start underperforming or I might screw it up. But there is less of a likelihood that I can bring it significantly better because it's already performing so well. On the contrary, if I'm going to buy a club that is currently underperforming and I'm buying a lot of players, etc., there is a big chance that I can bring this club really high and I can get a lot of profit and a lot of lot of delta from it, if you want to say that. But if it doesn't go well, given that the club is already underperforming, it is not going to be a disappointment, or I'm not going to lose as much if I'm not going to succeed. So this is why often it's the underperforming clubs or that are being targeted, and then you can just explain why this is something very good, insofar as if a club gets to do better, then all the things about enjoyment of sport obviously also get better. So one more thing in terms of how exactly the money of that wealthy owner can help that team get better. So I think in 3 ways. That is A, the fact that you are with the money and the capital, you are able to do things like buy coaches, managers, a lot of individuals who can do a lot of specific time-consuming preparation. So this looks like, for example, people being able to analyze the teams that you're going to be going against and being able to prepare specific tactics, or the sort of being able to decide which player should go in and go out in the specific times to be in terms of making it tactical. And I guess also in terms of the preparation training techniques that you can use for the players, something that obviously with more money and more experienced coaches who have that knowledge, you get better. Secondly, obviously, quite straightforward, you can bring in new players that often players that cost a lot of money the club would otherwise not be able to afford at all, which can make a big difference in the performance of that club. And lastly, I think it's probably the least important in terms of bringing in extra infrastructure, in terms of like health services, in terms of like building extra infrastructure for training, etc. This is probably less applicable to big clubs that are already decently big. So even if you are underperforming club in like Premier League, you probably already have that sort of infrastructure like physiotherapy, etc. But if it's a debate that targets like say small or local clubs, that sort of some extra money, maybe not from a billionaire, but just from someone who has money, can make a difference in terms of that infrastructure. The second thing you probably want to do, and that's quite important, is to explain why those wealthy owners are likely to cater to local communities, or at least they are unlikely to screw them over. Because I think I'm going to talk about it in a second. The argument that often the team that opposes the wealthy owner wants to make is to say, look, these people are going to come and they don't care. They are very outside of the local community. They don't care about them. They're likely to like screw them over. So you want to do analysis that is able to counter this. So the way you might want to do it is to point out that often, even if you are a wealthy foreign owner, you still depend on local fans to do things like visit your matches and create a sort of atmosphere of having a full stadium, etc. So often, I think the way you want to do it is to weigh it against explaining why this is more important than broadening the base beyond that local. The simple reason is it's hard for, even if you get a lot of fans from, I don't know, across the continent, they are unlikely to be visiting your matches. They're unlikely to be paying for those tickets because it's just not feasible. And insofar as you do want to have full stadiums, you don't want to like completely alienate all of your local fans because no one will like, it will just not look particularly well, and you're probably not going to get money from tickets if like no one is coming to your home matches because everyone's really angry. So that's the reason as to why those wealthy owners might have still an incentive to cater for local fans and not do all the bad things that I'm going to talk about in a second. So contrarily then, if you want to explain why these wealthy owners would be bad, I think the first reason that is maybe somewhat less plausible, but I think it is still the case sometimes, is that sometimes those are just very rich people who like the idea of having a football club. They buy it for entertainment and they just don't know what to do, what they are doing, and they make bad decisions because they just don't know. So basically treating it as like Football Manager, but like on a larger scale and like expensive. So obviously that is an example of how things can go wrong just because of the sort of negligence or lack of knowledge of the owner. But I think if you want to be more, I guess, baking the other side on their best and like engaging with the idea that that individual is probably somewhat rational, you can just point out that insofar as this owner likely cares about profit, because they are buying it, for example, to diversify their investments, they are likely to have some bad incentives as a result of that. So firstly, if you want to have profit, you probably have a desire to expand your fan base to a larger group beyond the local people. So this can look like things like changing the team and the players, changing the way the club is advertised, or like in some extreme cases, even though that does happen reasonably often, for example, moving the stadium to a different location. All of these things, like how the club is presenting, who is playing, etc., is changing the very core identity of the club. So again, the local fans that are currently already in are likely to suffer as a result of that. So again, it is important that you can clash it against, I think, the argument or like the analysis that I've given before, and explain why you're likely to prioritize having a broader group of fans as opposed to maintaining the local community. So I think what you can say is, in most cases, revenue, for example, from merch, is shipped online, so you don't need to like live in the proximity of that club. Often you get revenue from, for example, like the TV broadcasting rights, meaning that as a result of that, it again doesn't matter where you are located. You just want to have enough people that are interested in that particular match. So again, you are probably fine with maybe sacrificing some of the local support, especially if you can point out that, look, the local people are highly unlikely going to go anywhere anyway. If you can get a significantly larger group that can support you, if you do those changes. And I think lastly, if you care about profit, you also might have a desire to raise ticket prices, especially if you know that you have enough people who will be able to afford it. That again can ruin the experience for individuals from the local area that are maybe less wealthy and who can afford these less. Cool. If there are no questions on this either, then I can get the next slide. Okay, so the last thing on sports and economics, just to go through a couple more ways, extraneous ways to impact money and popularity, maybe beyond just like how much you enjoy the sport, etc. So this, again, you can tie it to, for example, if you're explaining why wealthy owners are good, you can just say, look, they have money. Here are the things they can do with money. Obviously, you have to, again, give the incentive analysis that we've gone through, but those are some impacts you can give. So, for example, you can talk about the fact that it often means that you can get development of local areas. This is, for example, because you get to set up things like academies, things like training infrastructure, things like specific playgrounds for the kids to play whichever sport it is. Two, there's often building of infrastructure in general, like not sports related, just because you want the area of the stadium or around to be nice, to be for people who are likely to be visiting and spending time around there. And lastly, revenues that you get from tourism. So if the club becomes popular and you are able to attract a lot of people in, people are going to be coming, they're going to be spending money in your local businesses. So again, especially if it's an area that is not already very touristy, this can be a massive boost in terms of the money they are able to get again. Secondly, you can talk about beyond local areas, you can talk about international expansion. So you can talk about the fact that clubs that have a lot of money with very wealthy owners who generate a lot of revenue can do things like academies or scouting in the developing world, which is obviously very good in terms of giving opportunities to people who are from economically deprived areas. Often, especially if you're talking about, say, more accessible sports like football, where people can start playing football without having to invest so much money into it. But if you get to be scouted and you get to be found as a talent, like it can raise that individual a lot. And then again, obviously, secondary impacts of once you are able to get and find talents from the developing world or any economically deprived area, you also improving that area through things like obviously the remittances if that individual gets really rich, or through things like tourism revenues, because often people do visit places just because they know that their favorite player is from there and they visited for that reason. So those are other things that you can say in explaining why money and popularity is good. Just a note on the international expansion. I think this is, for example, a way you can try to outweigh, even if you lose on your local fan base and how likely you are to cater to the local community, you can still try to outweigh and say that the benefits of having a lot of money, that there is an incentive to invest, say, in like scouting of the best talent somewhere abroad, the outweighs maybe some sort of sacrifices of the local community of that particular club. So again, that's a possible strategy you can also take. So I think this is all in terms of the economic clash. Unless there are any questions, obviously feel free to put it for the Q&A. Then we can go to social justice, and I would give it to Rhys for that.
Yeah. Wonderful. So I'm going to assume that people can hear me, and we'll start talking about the next area of sports debates. And this is where sports debates overlap with claims about social justice. Three things I want to do on this slide then. First, I want to identify, I think, the three main ways that you often see sports debates interacting or overlapping with social justice claims. Then we'll talk about the kind of tools you see in motions to solve these in kind of debate land. And finally, we'll talk about some common mechanisms that are useful to apply in sports debates. So first, let's talk about what the problems you often see coming up in this area are. I think there are three of them. The first is broadly representation problems within the worlds of sports. I think these come especially in things like managerial positions, but also often, for example, for players. This is especially true in what are, for example, financially less accessible sports, where you might need, for example, lots of equipment in order to start playing or participating, or lots of training, etc. That mean that it is difficult if you are from, for example, economically deprived backgrounds, to access them. So these are questions about, for example, what kind of players, managers you see represented in that sport, and what that means for the fans who interact with it. Secondly, in terms of problems you often see in overlap with social justice debates, often it's the case that sport has surrounding it cultures of things like racism, like violence, both on the pitch and also amongst fans that become topics of these debates. Thirdly, in debates, you will often see debates about gender inequality within sport itself, in particular in representation in terms of leagues. I think that comes in a couple of ways. For example, in terms of the screen time that is given to men or women's leagues, or indeed mixed leagues, but also in terms of, for example, the pay gap and how that impacts different players across leagues. In particular, I think it is useful to keep in mind that this pay gap often, I think, impacts players to a degree that is beyond what the average debater will say. I think a problem debaters often have is they have in mind kind of football players, or at least male football players' salaries being incredibly large. There is some degree of pay gap, but you're still getting paid a lot. I think it's useful to keep in mind in these debates that actually that pay gap can be more significant than you think. In particular, for lots of players in women's leagues, it can actually be the case in lots of sports and at lots of levels that that wage isn't enough to support you. And there is a phenomenon then of these people having to also work part-time jobs. And I think that makes this impact far more significant, and therefore actually a place in which debates can be set. That means that there are often sports motions that you see that have some tool in mind that's an attempt to solve these kinds of representational imbalances or these kind of cultures that are arising. To highlight two of them, to give you examples to keep in mind when we talk about some of the mechanisms you might see to solve these in a second, you should think of, for example, debates that set quotas in terms of representation on national sports teams. So, for example, you might see a debate about having an ethnicity quota that matches the representation on a sports team to the the proportions of representation within that country as a whole. You might also, for example, on clashes about cultures surrounding sports, see motions about various mechanisms of holding teams accountable for for example, violent behavior of their fans. These are the kind of debates we're thinking about then when we think about sports and social justice. I think often these social justice mechanisms, insofar as they're separated from sports, are pretty well done in these debates. What I want to do instead then is go through some of the specific things that link sports in particular to these kinds of mechanisms so that you can make that link. I see there's a question in the chat. I'll come back to that either once we've gone through these mechanisms or in the Q&A at the end. So 4 broad mechanisms I want to talk about in terms of sport as a tool for social progress. I think the first is perhaps the most obvious one. And this is just the claim that often players have a kind of national status that is going to allow them to actually generate discourse that people are going to listen to. They're going to do things like participate in interviews. They're going to do things like be very visible on TV. So, for example, Colin Kaepernick, who you see on the right, kneeling during the anthem, is something that generated huge amounts of discourse in America surrounding racism issues there, and is still generating discourse to this day. Often that means then there is a question in sports debates in terms of characterization for what kind of discourse it is you're going to get. I think what teams often miss here is that it's not automatic that this discourse is going to be positive. It can be the case, of course, that players can contribute to discourse in a negative way as well. And there is often, therefore, a characterization question when you're answering this kind of mechanism as to what kind of discourse it is you're going to get. The second broad way that sports debates might interact with tools for social progress that I think goes missed a little more is sport is often a way in which we socialize behavior in our children. I think there are broadly 2 ways you'll see this happening. The first is that often parents will just take their kids to sports games as a social activity that they enjoy, that they can do with their children. They think that this is something that they did in their childhood. It's nostalgic and it has value to them, and it's something that they want to give to their children as an experience as well, then as kind of a bonding thing for their family. That means you'll often see kids be taken to sporting events. They'll sit in the crowd, and therefore they will see as acceptable behavior the behavior that goes on around them. This might mean then that these children are being told that people who are like their parents, who support the same team as them, who they ought to identify with, are taking on certain kinds of behavior, and that might affect how that child behaves in future. I think the second way you will see this happen, even if those children don't attend those particular events, is that children are often also encouraged to play sports themselves. For example, in leagues with other children, or for example, in their schools, in, for example, physical education classes. In particular, then, if they have an expectation of how they should behave on the pitch, this is actually something that they get to enact and learn as a behavior themselves. And so often you will see children replicating behaviors that they might have seen in their favorite sports stars, for example, on the pitch, and internalizing those behaviors as acceptable. And so often sport, both through the fans and through the players, can be a mirror for how kids learn to behave. The third way I think sport interacts as a tool for social progress is that there is a kind of contact theory argument. So especially in, for example, the quota type debate that I talked about earlier for quotas for ethnic backgrounds on national teams, often you might see arguments that talk about how the fact that one identifies very strongly with your team means that you might have some kind of contact theory with them. So, for example, the argument might go that one of the things that contributes to racist behaviors, for example, microaggressions I might have, is just a feeling of otherness towards people of backgrounds that are different from me, that I don't understand them, I don't identify with them, and therefore it's more likely that I respond poorly when I interact with these people in my day-to-day life. The claim then in these debates might go that if it's the case that these people already play on my national sports team, and I already have a tight identity to that team for all of the reasons that Lucie was talking about earlier, then I'm less likely to see them in a way that's different from myself. That is, I'm already likely to see people from, for example, that ethnic background as in some sense part of my in-group that I might want to defend. And therefore, I'm likely to have normalized various views that are likely to reduce the kind of microaggressions I might be taking. I do want to highlight a common response that's given to this argument that leads to, I think, a characterization clash in terms of how fans might be responding. Because I think a claim you'll commonly hear in such debates is that if a fan is already racist, then the likely response they're going to have is a kind of confirmation bias response. That is, when the team does well, they're likely to say that they did well in spite of the new players who they might say are burdens on the team, that it was the players who had always been there playing particularly well. However, if the team does badly, because of their pre-existing prejudices, they're likely to blame this on the minority players on that team. And therefore, rather than challenging the narrative that they've built up, they're actually likely to reinforce that narrative even further and even more publicly actually push that narrative as well, because now they have a reason in their common discussion to actually be talking about that and saying those things. I think that means, in terms of contact theory, often these debates come down to a characterization clash about which route fans are most likely to take. Are they likely to identify strongly with their team as a whole, or via individual members of that team and assign blame to others? The final thing I want to say in terms of sports and social justice then is in terms of the kind of backlash clash that you're likely to see in these debates. So often there is a claim that you'll see being made that something that teams have to worry about is all of their fans, if they don't like a decision that you've made, just leaving that team and going and supporting another team or another individual instead. And as a result, it's hard for teams to just make progress. I think there are lots of reasons why this is actually unlikely to happen, ranging from example, from just geographical proximity to your team, making it easier to go to their events and watch them, to all of the reasons that Lucie said as to why you're likely to have formed an identity that's going to be attached to them, that you have nostalgia because you attended those events as a children, that you've built up a connection by spending lots of time, I don't know, down at the pub with your mates watching that game and going through the highs and lows as part of a social connection. The fact that your friends are likely also to be supporting the same team, and it will be seen as an act of betrayal then if you leave them to support another team, and so on. I think what that means in these debates, often it's an unrealistic characterization to just say that it is really easy for fans to leave their team entirely, because there are lots of things that tie a fan to an individual team, or in the case of, I don't know, more individual sports, to a particular athlete that they might support. However, I don't think this means that backlash is impossible. There are lots of other ways through which fans might do actions that we would call kind of backlash type actions. I think a common example of this might be an increase in microaggressions or increase in violent behavior, especially at events where they might be acting as support. So I hinted at this earlier. The kind of thing I have in mind here, for example, is, I don't know, when there's a group of fans watching the game at a pub, they're much more likely to say things that have racist undertones in very negative kind of tones, and other people might be at that pub hearing that behavior. You might start to see violent clashes as a result. They might still support the same team, but there are other outlets through which they can enact behavior that we would characterize then as backlash. Let me now, before we move on to the next slide, where we're going to talk about sports and how they connect to IR debates, answer the question we had. So the question is, why is representation within sport as a whole necessarily a problem, especially in situations where a group also isn't very interested in watching that specific sport? I think there's a trade-off going on here. If it's the case that not very many people watch a specific sport, then it's probably quite likely that CA teams won't have set motions about it, or if they have, the impacts of that motions will have been toned down comparably, such that I still care about any of the changes that that small group of fans watching it might feel. However, obviously, for other sports where more people watch it, these impacts tone up, and I'm likely to care. In particular, I think there's two ways you can think about the representation clash. One is for the people who come from that particular background in terms of how they construct their own identity and how they think their identity fits into society. I think this is very similar to the same kind of representation stuff we talked about in the art workshop. So I don't want to go over that analysis again. If you want to hear it, I think it's worth going back on YouTube, for example, and watching through that section on representation in arts debates. I think that the analysis is basically the same analysis copied over. I think there is a second way that this analysis plays out, though, and that's in terms of engaging when you aren't from that background. And this is the kind of contact theory type argumentation that we were giving just a second ago. In particular, this contact theory argumentation tells me that even if people from that particular, I don't know, ethnic group, background, cultural context aren't watching this sport, they probably are still interacting with other people who do. And those interactions are probably what the CA team had in mind when they set the debate. If this social justice clash of this type is one of the ones that's arising. In particular, then you probably care about that kind of argumentation regardless, and therefore you are able to access those kinds of impacts on representation. Hopefully that answered that question. If there are any others, I'll come back to them in the Q&A at the end, but do feel free to type them in the Zoom chat now. Otherwise, we'll move on and we'll talk finally about sports and how they connect to international relations. So the kind of thing I want to say at the top of this slide is I think most of the motions you'll see on this theme really relate to international sporting events, in particular, often the question of who it might be, which country it might be that's going to be hosting them. There are other motions that fit into this category, but most motions, as I say, are of this type. And so we're going to, for the purposes of this workshop, primarily keep these examples about hosting international sporting events in mind. So for example, the world's motion about abolishing the Olympics, or motions about FIFA stripping hosting rights for the World Cup from Qatar, and so on. These are the kinds of motions and clashes that you ought to keep in mind as examples. I want to run through then three common themes of arguments I think you see in these debates that are useful to know of. Firstly, I want to talk about governments in terms of how they use sports as a tool to entrench power. So this is especially if you're talking about potentially oppressive governments actually being able to access the hosting rights for international sporting events and what it is they might do with this. I think there's broadly two ways in which these hosting rights are a tool to entrench your power. Obviously, this analysis does copy over to the other example motions I'm talking about as well, but I think it'll be useful to make these a little bit more concrete. So what are these two ways? Firstly, I think often when a country is able to do well in sports, there is just a surge of patriotism that happens there. That is, all of the stuff that Lucie said about why people often form their identity around sports, I think applies at a national level. There are reasons why especially in countries where things have been difficult, having a sports team who is performing well at a national level is something that is uniting. It's something that gives that country hope, and in particular then is likely to be something that draws large groups of people together in support. Because that's what's most likely to, for example, form community that makes people happy and so on. The problem with this, you might say then, is that when you've constructed the thing that you are gaining hope or enjoyment from as something that is inherently patriotic, that is tied to your country, and is something that you would say is your country doing well, it becomes a lot harder for you to criticize that government or that country. You're much less likely to challenge that because you've built the idea in your head that your country is something that you should be proud of. And there is a dissonance then with simultaneously challenging that. I think the second way that this entrenchment of power plays out, especially in debates about hosting international sporting events, is that the government is able to use this as a propaganda tool. And this applies just to success of their sporting team as well. That is, they might be able to say things like, to use the example of this question of hosting, that of all the countries in the world, we were the one that was respected enough to get to host this event. That means it's not just internally that we're a respected country, but rather we are a strong government who's able to garner respect on the world stage from all of these other countries. They want us to host this event, and therefore you ought to support us and not question us. That is, sports, and in particular success in sport at the national level, is a way to construct kind of propaganda in order to increase the perceptions of strength of that government. And in particular, then it becomes much harder to challenge them if people aren't expecting those challenges to either be necessary or likely successful. Secondly, in terms of common arguments, in terms of especially international sporting events, I want to talk about human rights abuses that often even stem from or increase as a result of questions of hosting. The broad reason that this happens is that often sporting events just require you to construct huge amounts of infrastructure incredibly quickly and on an incredibly large scale. So, for example, if you want to host the Olympics, it's probably the case that you're going to have to construct a number of different sporting arenas in a small amount of space and probably quite quickly in order to be ready to host that event. If you want to host the World Cup, probably something similar. What that means is that I think two things often happen. One, in the rush to try to do this construction quickly and cheaply, often bad working conditions arise. That is, you are likely to undercut on worker rights, on pay, and so on, in order to try to meet the demands on your country. So an example of this is that construction for stadiums in Qatar was primarily done by immigrant workers whose passports had been seized in order to keep them there in bad working conditions and at low pay. And there were lots of concerns on the international level about the working conditions that were arising in order to meet the construction demands. I think the second way, though, that you see these abuses arising is that often it's just the case that you don't have very many areas in which to construct. And that means that you often have to displace some existing set of people from where it is they live or do business in order to find a suitable place to construct your stadiums, etc. In particular, because of the way political capital works, i.e. who is most likely to be able to resist you, often people who are impoverished end up getting disrupted or displaced by such construction efforts. So you might see, for example, demolitions of their homes, things like favelas, in order to actually construct stadia. You also might see that these areas are sanitized, even if the stadiums aren't constructed there, just because they're close to where those stadia are being constructed. And the government of that country expects, therefore, there to be lots of international media attention in that area. And they want it to, therefore, look much cleaner, much wealthier than it is, because they think that's the perception of their country that international observers are going to have. As a result, you often see, for example, mass displacement as a result of this construction. And I think that obviously then is a bad outcome to be happening. The final question in terms of common argumentation in these debates I want to talk about, and what I think is often the big clash, is media portrayal for ongoing issues and how it is this works out. So I think the obvious first claim that often gets made in these debates that is going to be kind of the hinge on which everything else follows is that if you are going to be hosting an international sporting event, you're probably going to get much more media attention that will highlight any ongoing issues you have as a result. In particular, I think the useful analysis here is that it might be the case that, for example, NGOs, charities, or investigative journalists might already be aware to some extent of these issues and might be trying to highlight it, but it's incredibly hard to get that thing published in a way that captures international media attention. However, once you're hosting an international sporting event, those things are much more likely to hit the headlines. People are much more likely to be willing to read them, and therefore it's potentially useful that sporting event was there in order to get this story to actually hit the headlines. The question, once you've said that in these debates then, is this international media attention enough to actually reach change? I think there's two things to say that might mean that you don't believe this, although there is a characterization question then to happen here. Firstly, I think individuals are often going to pay attention more to the general tone of the media that they consume around that sporting event. And the general tone of such material is often quite happy, quite colourful. It shows the events in incredibly positive lights. I think both because, for example, there are official promotion materials that they're consuming that are made by the government who are actually running that event, and in particular, therefore, are presenting it with a certain bias in mind, but also just often because the way we construct narratives around sport is that we want to see them as examples of human success. We want to have a team or an individual winning at the end, and we want to celebrate them. And in particular, then, if the way you're interacting with that sport isn't by watching all of the coverage, but you're watching, for example, I don't know, the individual game or the individual, let's say, competition, the narrative you're likely to get is likely to be a quite positive one. And that's the emotional connotation, therefore, you're likely to take away. And what that means is even if you are kind of cognitively aware that these headlines exist, if your emotional connotation with the whole thing is quite positive, you're unlikely to weigh that as being anything particularly important. The second thing I think you can say here is that athletes themselves often get to see what is a highly sanitized version of the country. They are housed in a particular area that was constructed just for them. And often governments have constructed the surroundings of those areas to give a very particular perception that might hide from them the particular issues that are being faced there. In particular, then, when they talk about their experience of going to that country for that sporting event, often they're going to say things that are quite positive, that it might be better than they expected or better than the headlines are saying. And given that I think when people watch sporting events, they primarily actually interact with them through the testimony of athletes, because those are the people they see in, for example, post-match or post-competition interviews. This is often, I think, quite harmful to the idea that these are deep and serious issues if the people who you are primarily trusting to tell you about them are saying they're not as bad as you expect. Obviously, that doesn't mean it's always the case that you aren't able to successfully highlight issues. It might be, for example, that athletes themselves have an individual athlete has a particularly bad experience. It might be that they have, for example, difficulties entering that country based on their own identity. Sometimes comes up, for example, with LGBTQ athletes, etc. And those might be particular powerful stories, especially when other athletes are in community with them, are friends with them because they've competed together and might rally to some extent. I think, therefore, there is a characterization battle, again, to be fought here. And it's often, therefore, worth understanding that that might be where the individual debate might play out. That is everything I think we wanted to say about sports and international relations. And therefore, apart from the Q&A at the end of this workshop, as usual, we'll have a SPA debate in a little while. But first, does anyone have any questions, either about this slide or anything we've said in the workshop? Okay. There are a couple of questions coming through. They are quite long, so you'll have to give me a chance to read them. Okay, so the first question is, it seems a lot easier to justify a wider or more international fan base over local fans because most of the identity forming behaviors are still available, even if you're not in the area. So it's probably good if more people get to access the funds of the sport. Would you then draw the comparison to the infrastructure and other local benefits thing, or is there another way to win this comparative for local fans? I would question honestly, whether it is true that most of the identity forming behaviors are still available to the same extent. So for example, if I'm socialized to engage well in a particular sport, what that probably means is when I was young, my family supported that sport. They took me down to the pub. All their friends were there. They were all wearing, the same team's kit. They were all cheering when that team scored a goal. And I got to feel the excitement of being in that environment with people cheering around me. It might be the case that that's possible on the international level. It's a lot less likely to happen though, because it's a lot less likely that you live in a community surrounded by people who are fans of the same team that you are, that there is always a pub who's going to show your game that you can go down to, for example, that you're able to attend that stadium and be in the environment of fans cheering around you because you have to travel much further and so on. So the first thing is that the way you engage, if you're an internationally based fan, probably is less, let's say, emotionally charged than if you're a local fan, just because some of the identity forming behaviors are less available to you, or at least are less likely to be available to you. What that also means, though, is that the level of good you get in terms of access is probably less. What that means is if you're a local fan, for example, for a small local club, maybe that club isn't, topping the league, but it's still important to you when they score a goal because of the environment it creates around you and the interactions you have with your friend. If you're an international fan, you might be interacting with that fan base online, but there's nothing unique about that fan base. You could be interacting with the fan base of any other team internationally, especially if you don't have a local community built up around you for the reasons I just said. And in particular, then I think the other way you can weigh this, even if it is the case that international fans get quite a lot of good out of supporting a team, is that they're not getting that good because they support this particular team, and therefore there is a question of uniqueness. It might be better if you're going to be trading off that all those international fans were to go support some other team where they wouldn't be taking away a unique good that accrues for local fans. Hopefully that answers that question. There was another, let me just read it. Okay, so this question is a particular question about the structure of the Olympic Committee. I'm going to be honest up front and say that my spec knowledge here is not great. Maybe Lucie will have more. I will attempt to answer anyway, though, but you should take everything I say that sounds specky with a grain of salt. So the question is, say I'm on prop on a policy motion that is about countries with poor human rights records hosting these events. Could a reasonable model to preempt the human rights abuses say that, for example, the Olympic Committee gives loans to these countries contingent on not taking on bad behaviors? I think there's a couple of comments I'd make here. Firstly, I'm not sure how likely it is that you would be in this circumstance, because if you're on, I suppose you would actually be on op and you would be counter-propping rather than on gov. In which case, I suppose this is feasible. It seems unlikely to me that you would be on gov on a motion about allowing, given that that's the status quo. I also think it's usually the case that these tend to be analysis motions. However, the kind of big exception to this, I suppose, is obviously the recent World's motion about abolishing the Olympics, in which case one of the things you can do in that motion that I think is quite sensible is counter-propping being a lot more reasonable. I think the thing I would say is there are obviously going to be funding issues here. In particular, it seems strange to me to make the claim that the various voting mechanisms that go into that committee are going to be willing to give these loans if they are already willing to look away from these issues when they are allocating to countries in the first place. It's unclear to me why you wouldn't just allocate elsewhere. And in particular, also, it's unclear to me how many of these issues can just be solved by throwing more money at the problem. If the problem is, for example, construction speed, or, for example, having somewhere to construct in the first place, these aren't issues that are about the amount of funding that you have. They're issues just about that country in terms of its capacity to host in the first place. And throwing more money at the problem doesn't solve it. So whilst you might be able to do this in some debates, I don't think it breaks those motions, because the kind of analysis we were highlighting, I think, is still applicable there. Are there any other questions?